Whoever killed Craig covered their tracks meticulously, using chemicals to mask the odor, disabling security cameras, and hiding in plain sight. And while detectives spend months trying to figure out where Craig went, the suspected killer quietly continues spending Craig's money, allegedly buying houses, cars, and crafting a plan to ensure they are never found.
Holy smokes.
I want to say something else, but I don't want to implicate her.
The mountains outside Cloudcroft, New Mexico keep their secrets well. In late May 2025, a deputy from the Otero County Sheriff's Office drove up a long gravel driveway to a 3-story house set among ponderosa pines. The property belonged to 60-year-old Craig Thetford, a roofing contractor who had built a comfortable life there with his wife Dina. The call that sent the deputy was routine on its face. A friend in Texas named Larry Scott had grown worried after trying to reach Craig for nearly 2 months. No calls returned, no texts answered. Even Craig's family had heard nothing. That kind of silence, Larry explained, was not like him. The deputy walked the perimeter, peering through windows. Lights were on inside. Boxes were stacked near the door as though someone was in the middle of moving. He circled toward a carport attached to the side of the home, and there the air changed. A faint, unpleasant odor drifted through the space, something organic, slightly sweet. Up in the mountains, wildlife and decaying vegetation can produce all kinds of smells, so he noted it only briefly before moving on. What he did not know, what no one yet knew, was that Craig Thetford lay only feet away, buried beneath materials carefully arranged to hide him. The deputy completed his check, marked the residence as vacant, and drove away. The first opportunity to find Craig had passed without anyone realizing it. The next day, a second call came in. This time it was Craig's grandson, Cody Gibson, and his voice carried an urgency the first call had lacked. He told the dispatcher that his grandfather had essentially vanished 4 months earlier, not 2, as Larry had believed. The only person claiming to have had any contact with Craig since January was his wife Dina. According to Dina, Craig had filed for divorce, taken up with another woman, and was now living somewhere in Mexico. Cody did not believe it. His grandfather was a volunteer firefighter who loved his work, who called his family regularly, who did not simply disappear. Something, he said, was wrong. That second call changed the nature of the inquiry. Deputies returned to the property, this time with a broader focus. If Craig and Dina were not inside the house, perhaps someone nearby had seen something. They began knocking on doors, speaking with neighbors who lived within view of the Thetford home. One of the first they encountered was a man named Thomas, a fellow firefighter who had served alongside Craig on the James Canyon Fire Department. Thomas had been worried for months. He told the deputy that he and Craig were close, that they had talked often, and then suddenly around January, all contact stopped. Thomas had tried to reach out, but there was no answer, no explanation. When the deputy asked if he knew anything about Dina's whereabouts, Thomas hesitated. Then he said something that would lodge itself in the minds of everyone who heard it. He had tried to warn Craig, he said. Dina had made a statement in front of him and his wife, a statement that now echoed with a chilling clarity. If I could kill Craig and get away with it, I would do it. The deputies also spoke with a neighbor named Heidi, who lived in an A-frame house just up the road. Heidi told them she and her husband were in the process of buying the property from Craig. She said Dina had told her that Craig was in Texas taking care of his mother, and that the two were separating. Heidi had no reason to doubt the story, but she also admitted she had not seen Craig in months. Dina, she said, had been in and out, but even she seemed evasive about her husband's whereabouts. When the deputies asked for Dina's phone number, Heidi provided it. A call was placed immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. Later that day, the return call came. Dina Thetford was on the line, her voice calm, measured. She confirmed that she and Craig were separated. She had filed for divorce, she said, after discovering he was involved with someone else. She told the deputy that Craig had left the house, that he was in Mexico, and that she had no reason to think anything was wrong. She was staying with her mother in Texas for the time being, but planned to return to New Mexico to fight for the property in the divorce. The deputy thanked her and ended the call. On the surface, it was a story that made sense. A messy divorce, a husband who chose to leave, a wife who moved on. But the inconsistencies were already surfacing. To Craig's grandson, Dina had said Craig went to Mexico after filing for divorce. To the neighbor, she had said he was in Texas caring for his mother. And to the deputy, she said he had left after she discovered an affair. The details did not line up, yet without any evidence of harm, there was little law enforcement could do except note the discrepancies and wait. In the days that followed, Craig Thatford was entered into the FBI database as a missing person. The case was assigned to Detective Bobby Curtis of the district's Major Crimes Unit. Curtis was methodical, the kind of investigator who built cases brick by brick. She began by assembling a profile of the couple, and one detail stood out almost immediately. Craig was Dina's fourth husband. 3 previous marriages had ended under circumstances that, when examined, raised serious questions. Curtis reached out to the ex-husbands. What she heard from them painted a portrait of a woman whose behavior had long been volatile. One, who had been married to Dina 30 years earlier, described her as someone who became unrecognizable when she drank. He recalled an incident where she tried to run him over with a car. Another ex-husband, a man named Scott, spoke with a mixture of resignation and fear. He told Curtis that Dina's drinking turned her aggressive, that she had assaulted him multiple times, that she had once chased him with a pistol, pulling the trigger repeatedly. The gun was not loaded, he said, but the intent was clear. He also recounted something Dina had said in front of him and his wife. The same statement Thomas had heard. "If I could kill Craig and get away with it, I would do it." Scott's words stayed with Detective Curtis. She began to dig deeper into Dina's history, pulling records that confirmed what the ex-husbands had described. Dina had worked as a correctional officer for nearly 8 years, a job that required discipline and control, but also placed her in environments where violence was a daily reality. In 2008, according to police reports, Dina was arrested for allegedly trying to stab Scott while intoxicated. She spent a night in jail. The couple briefly reconciled after that, but the marriage eventually ended. A few years later, Scott alleged that Dina found his pistol and chased him while pulling the trigger. The gun was not loaded, and he survived. Curtis also learned that Dina had a daughter, Leslie, who had lived with her mother and Craig for a time. When an investigator reached Leslie by phone, she did not hold back. Leslie described her mother as someone she had feared for much of her life. She said Dina had tried to kill her before, that she had stabbed one of her other husbands, that she had once had Leslie's sister hogtied and sent away. Leslie's words were stark. "My mom is crazy. I always thought she was like possessed, like demonic. It was so evil that I couldn't even believe it was real." She also mentioned something that made the detective pause. Dina, she said, was an alcoholic who also used other drugs, and Leslie had suspected at times that her mother might have been poisoning Craig or tampering with his medication. By now, the investigation had shifted from a search for a missing person to something far more urgent. The possibility that Craig was dead and that Dina was involved was no longer a theory. It was a working hypothesis supported by multiple witnesses, each with their own stories of violence and threats. But Curtis knew that suspicion alone would not hold up in court. She needed evidence that connected Dina directly to Craig's disappearance. She turned to the couple's financial records. What she found was a pattern that defied any innocent explanation. Over the previous 4 months, the same months during which Craig had allegedly been living in Mexico with another woman, hundreds of thousands of dollars had been spent. Dina had purchased a new house. She had bought a new car. She appeared to have helped fund a business for her son. The spending was extravagant, sustained, and entirely inconsistent with the behavior of a woman whose husband had simply walked away. When combined with the witness statements, The financial trail suggested a different story. Craig had not left of his own accord. Someone had taken control of his assets, and that someone was spending as if there would never be any consequences. But without a body, without a crime scene, there was still no way to obtain a warrant. The investigation remained in a kind of limbo, waiting for something to break. That break came in the form of a tip. Someone reported that Dina had returned to the Cloudcroft house and was acting as if nothing had happened. Deputy Roger Schoolcraft, a veteran investigator who had retired from the Albuquerque Police Department's homicide unit and returned to work part-time, was dispatched to follow up. Roger had spent most of his career investigating murders. He had a calm, unhurried manner that often put people at ease. But behind his eyes was the experience of someone who had learned to listen for what was not being said. When Roger arrived, he found Dina outside, calm and cooperative. She invited him in. Over the next hour, he sat in her living room and listened as she wove a story that had grown more elaborate since her first call to deputies. She said she and Craig had been having issues since mid-February. He had left to help his mother in Texas, she said, and then he had simply stopped communicating. She claimed she had no reason to doubt him, but now she was beginning to wonder. Maybe, she said, he had gone to Mexico with some younger woman he met in one of his classes. She pointed to a note on a nearby table. This, she said, was how Craig had been communicating with her for the past 2 months. She handed it to Roger. It was a short message mentioning a place called El Salto, a fishing destination in Mexico. Roger examined the note, then asked if he could see the safe she had mentioned in earlier conversations. Dina led him downstairs to a corner of the basement where 2 large safes stood. She claimed she did not have the combinations, that Craig had never given them to her, that the money inside was a point of contention between him and his first wife. She told Roger there was $1.5 million in cash inside. Roger looked at the safes, at the basement around him. He did not yet know that this was the room where Craig's body had lain for days before being moved. He noted the details, then followed Dina back upstairs. Before he left, he decided to let her know exactly who she was talking to. He told her, matter-of-factly, that he was a retired homicide detective, that most of his career had been spent investigating murders. He watched her face shift, a flicker of something that might have been alarm, before she composed herself. He left the house, but he did not leave the neighborhood. Instead, he began walking to the homes of the people who lived nearby, asking them what they had seen, what they had heard, what they thought had happened to Craig Thetford. Jay, the first neighbor Roger spoke with, confirmed what others had hinted at. Craig had confided in him, saying that if anything ever happened, Dina should be the first person police talked to. The neighbor also contradicted Dina's claim about the safe, saying Craig had told him Dina did know the combination. Another neighbor, Heidi, the woman who had spoken with deputies before, told Roger she had been holding something back. She did not want to implicate anyone, she said, but she had heard Dina make a comment when they first moved in. It was something to the effect that if Craig were to die, she would be okay with it. Heidi said she had tried to dismiss it at the time, but now, with Craig missing, she could not ignore it. Roger recorded everything and returned to the station. The evidence was stacking up, but it was all circumstantial. They had a missing man, a wife whose story kept changing, witnesses who described a history of violence, and a trail of money that led directly to Dina. What they did not have was a body, and without a body, they could not move forward. 5 days later, Roger returned to the Thetford property. This time, when he arrived, he noticed something unusual. A large hole had been dug in the ground near the house. Dina told him she was trying to flatten the area, that she was going to roll some rocks back into it. Roger made a note of it but said nothing. The conversation that followed was brief. Dina seemed more guarded than before. At one point, she made a statement that struck Roger as odd. She said, "I think, if I had just left when he told me to, then none of this would have happened." Roger asked her what she meant, but she did not elaborate. After that visit, Dina vanished. Calls went unanswered. Detectives learned she had been seen at her mother's house in Texas, but she was not there when they checked. Rumors circulated that she was talking about fleeing to Jamaica. Then came news that she had attempted to take her own life. Detective Curtis knew she had to act fast. If Dina succeeded in harming herself or disappeared entirely, the truth about what happened to Craig might never be known. A call came in that pushed everything into motion. An old co-worker of Dina's from her days as a correctional officer reached out to Detective Curtis. He said Dina had recently contacted him and confessed. She told him she had shot Craig. The man said he had a conscience and could not stay silent. It was the break investigators had been waiting for. Armed with that tip and the mounting circumstantial evidence, Detective Curtis obtained a search warrant for the Thatford property. On the day the warrant was executed, a team of deputies and detectives converged on the house. They entered through the garage, sweeping room by room. In the basement, they found the safes. A locksmith was brought in to open them. Inside, instead of the $1.5 million Dina had claimed, they found just over $84,000. The rest of the money was gone, spent on houses, cars, and other purchases that Dina had made in the months since Craig's disappearance. Upstairs, they found bleach bottles scattered throughout the house, signs of a thorough cleanup. The security system appeared to have been physically disabled. In a workshop area, they noticed what looked like possible blood spatter on a table saw, but there was no body. They searched the house, the outbuildings, the man cave. Still nothing. Back at the station, a detective received a phone call from Dina's daughter, Leslie. This time, Leslie was not speaking about her mother's past. She was speaking about the present. She told the detective that her mother had come to see her one last time, wanting to say goodbye to her grandson. During that visit, Dina had finally told her what happened. According to Leslie, Dina said Craig had pushed her down the stairs. She shot him. He fell into the pool room. She left his body on the floor for a day, maybe two. Then she wrapped him in plastic and a rug, and with the help of someone else, she used a tractor to move him to one of the carports on the property. Leslie said she believed he was buried there, hidden in plain sight, possibly with something parked on top of him. The information from Leslie was relayed immediately to the team still searching the property. They turned their attention to the detached metal carport west of the main house. It was a structure that had been overlooked in the initial sweep, a place where farm equipment and storage boxes were kept, the kind of area that could easily be dismissed as cluttered but ordinary. Now, with Leslie's words guiding them, they began to clear away the debris. There, next to a tractor, they found a large pile of cardboard boxes, soil bags, rugs, and other materials that seemed out of place. The pile was deliberate, arranged with the apparent purpose of covering something. As they moved the items, a black plastic sheeting became visible. Beneath the plastic, they found the remains of a man. The discovery brought a silence over the property. For months, the answer to what happened to Craig Thatford had been sitting in that carport, hidden under boxes and plastic, waiting to be found. The odor that the first deputy had noticed and dismissed, that faint, sweet smell of decomposition, had been coming from this spot. But in the mountain air, with wildlife and forest all around, it had been easy to explain away. Now there was no mistaking it. The body was transported to the office of the medical investigator. An autopsy revealed that Craig had been dead for weeks to months, consistent with a death in late January. There were 3 or 4 gunshot wounds on the left side, one of which had passed through his heart. The manner of death was classified as homicide. Fingerprints confirmed the victim was Craig Thatford. An arrest warrant was issued for Dina Thatford on charges of first-degree murder and tampering with evidence. Law enforcement agencies in New Mexico and Texas were put on alert. Within hours, Dina's mother contacted authorities to say her daughter was at Red River Hospital. Officers arrived and took Dina into custody without incident. When Detective Curtis sat down with Dina in the interrogation room, she expected a long conversation. There was so much she wanted to ask. Why had Dina told so many different stories about where Craig went? What had happened in the house that night? Who had helped her move the body? And the question that haunted everyone who had worked the case: why? But Dina had been preparing for this moment. She looked at Detective Curtis and said, "And I'm just going to tell you right now, I'm going to need a lawyer." That was all. The interview ended almost as soon as it began. Dina was booked into the Otero County Detention Center without bond, charged with first-degree murder and tampering with evidence. In the months that followed, prosecutors began building a case that would rely almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. They had no eyewitness to the shooting, no confession, no direct physical evidence placing Dina at the scene with the weapon. What they had instead was a web of facts that, taken together, told a story with only one reasonable conclusion. They had Dina's shifting statements, first that Craig was in Texas, then that he was in Mexico, then that he was with another woman. They had the testimony of ex-husbands who described a pattern of violence and threats. They had her own daughter's account of what Dina had confessed. They had the financial records showing that Dina had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in the months after Craig's disappearance, including the purchase of a new house and a new car. They had the physical evidence from the property, the bleach bottles, the disabled security system, the blood spatter in the workshop, and finally, Craig's body hidden under the carport. And they had Dina's own words, spoken to friends and neighbors years before any of this happened. "If I could kill Craig and get away with it, I would do it." As the prosecution prepared for trial, they organized their evidence into a narrative that would be presented to a jury. The story would begin with Craig and Dina's marriage, a relationship that seemed stable on the surface, but was marked by tension, alcohol, and a history of domestic incidents. It would move through the months after Craig's disappearance, when Dina told everyone a different version of where he had gone. It would highlight the financial trail, the money that had been drained from the safe, the new house, the new car, the business funded for her son. It would present the witnesses who had heard Dina threaten Craig's life. And it would end with the discovery of Craig's body in the carport, hidden under a pile of boxes and plastic. The defense, meanwhile, would likely argue that the evidence was purely circumstantial, that there was no proof Dina fired the gun, that someone else could have killed Craig, and Dina was simply trying to protect herself or had been afraid of him. They might point to the note Dina claimed Craig had left, suggesting he was alive and in Mexico. They might question the reliability of the witnesses, many of whom had their own complicated histories with Dina. But the prosecution had one piece of evidence that was difficult to explain away: the note itself. When investigators examined it, they found no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing to definitively link it to Craig. And the handwriting, when compared to samples of Craig's writing, raised questions. Moreover, the story Dina told about the note, that it was the only way Craig had communicated with her for months, did not match the financial records showing that someone had been using Craig's accounts and assets during that same period. As of March 2026, Dina Thetford remained in custody awaiting trial. She had entered a plea of not guilty. If convicted of first-degree murder, she faced life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. A conviction on second-degree murder would carry a sentence of up to 18 years, with additional time for tampering with evidence. The case of Craig Thetford is a story about the limits of perception and the weight of words spoken in private. On that first welfare check, a deputy walked past a carport, caught a strange smell in the air, and kept walking. He did not know that he was only feet away from the man he had been sent to find. He did not know that the odor, faint and easily dismissed, was the only clue that would ever be given freely. Everything else had to be pried loose: the statements from neighbors, the confessions from ex-husbands, the phone call from a daughter who had finally decided to speak, the financial records that showed money moving out of accounts no one was supposed to access. What makes this case unsettling is not the violence itself, though that is brutal enough. It is the careful, methodical way someone tried to erase a life. The security cameras were disabled. The house was cleaned with bleach. The body was wrapped and moved and hidden under materials meant to mask any odor. And all the while, a story was told and retold, each version slightly different, but all pointing in the same direction. Craig was gone, and it was his own choice. But stories have a way of unraveling when enough people begin to question them. Craig's grandson refused to accept the version he was told. His friend Larry kept calling, kept asking, kept pushing until someone listened. The neighbors, when asked, shared what they had heard. The ex-husbands, when contacted, told the truth about what they had endured. And in the end, the person who knew the most about what had happened, Dina's own daughter, could not carry the weight of it alone. Craig Thetford was a volunteer firefighter, a man who spent his life running toward emergencies when others ran away. He built a business, owned property, traveled, and loved his family. In the last months of his life, he was living with someone who had threatened him, someone whose past was marked by violence, someone who had told friends and strangers alike what she would do if she thought she could get away with it. Whether anyone tried to warn him, whether he understood the danger he was in, may never be known. What is known is that when he disappeared, the person closest to him did not search for him, did not report him missing, did not answer calls from his family. Instead, she spent his money, told his story, and waited for everyone to stop asking. They did not stop. And in the end, the truth had a way of rising to the surface, even when someone had worked so hard to bury it.